When the world hears the name Somalia, the images that immediately surface are not beaches or ancient cities, not poets or traders, not sailors or scholars, but headlines of war, famine, piracy, and chaos. Yet Somalia is not a country born from collapse. It is a civilization that survived collapse. Long before modern borders, before colonial maps, before global trade routes were drawn by European powers, Somalia stood at the crossroads of the ancient world, connecting Africa, Arabia, Persia, India, and the Mediterranean through winds, waves, and words. Somalia's story is not one of endless violence. It is one of endurance, identity, and memory, shaped by deserts and oceans, camels and ships, clan ties and poetry, faith and survival. This land has produced traders who sailed farther than most empires dared, warriors who resisted colonial armies longer than expected, and communities that endured the complete disappearance of a central government and still lived. Somalia is not just a nation, it is an idea that refuses to die, carried in language, lineage, and belief. To understand Somalia, one must strip away fear-driven narratives and listen to the long echo of its past, because Somalia's present, however fragile, cannot be understood without its ancient glory, its violent interruptions, and its stubborn hope. This documentary is not about what Somalia lost, but about what it has never lost: its identity. Somalia's story begins not with war, but with geography, because few countries on Earth are shaped as deeply by their physical position as Somalia is. Sitting at the Horn of Africa, Somalia commands the longest coastline on mainland Africa, over 3,300 kilometers stretching along the Indian Ocean and the Gulf of Aden, directly overlooking one of the world's most important maritime corridors, linking Asia, the Middle East, and Europe. This strategic position made Somalia a gateway, a bridge between continents, and a prize coveted by traders and empires for thousands of years. Inland, Somalia's landscape shifts dramatically, from fertile river valleys along the Shabelle and Juba rivers to vast arid plains and deserts, where nomadic pastoralism became not just a way of life, but a survival strategy. These harsh conditions forged a people who value mobility, kinship, and resilience above all else. Geography also shaped Somalia's political destiny. Open coastlines invited trade, but also invasion. Harsh interiors protected independence, but hindered centralized rule. Somalia was never meant to be governed like a European state. It evolved as a network of clans, trade cities, and seasonal movement, long before the concept of modern borders existed. Understanding Somalia's geography is understanding why unity and fragmentation have always coexisted here. why the land both connects and divides, and why Somali identity was forged long before Somalia became a country. Somali identity is among the most distinct in Africa, built on three powerful pillars: a shared language, a shared faith, and a deeply rooted clan system that predates the modern state by centuries. Unlike many African nations shaped by colonial borders that forced multiple ethnic groups together, Somalia is remarkably homogeneous in language and religion, with the overwhelming majority of Somalis speaking Somali and practicing Sunni Islam. Yet unity does not mean simplicity. Clan identity functions as both a social safety net and a political framework, organizing protection, marriage, conflict resolution, and survival in an environment where centralized authority was historically weak. Poetry is the soul of Somali culture, used to record history, praise heroes, insult enemies, and negotiate peace. And in Somali society, words can carry the weight of weapons. Islam arrived early in Somalia, within years of the Prophet Muhammad's lifetime, embedding faith deeply into daily life while blending with pre-Islamic customs. This fusion created a culture where religion guides ethics and law, but clan lineage defines loyalty and belonging. Somalia's identity is not fragile. It is rigid, deeply memorized, and orally preserved, which is why even decades of war could not erase it. The Somali state collapsed, but Somali identity never did. Long before Somalia was called Somalia, ancient Egyptians knew this land as the land of Punt, a mysterious and wealthy trading partner that supplied incense, gold, myrrh, ebony, and exotic animals. Egyptian reliefs dating back over 4,000 years depict Somali traders arriving by ship, proving that Somalia was integrated into global trade networks at the dawn of recorded history. Later, Somali coastal cities became vital ports in the Indian Ocean trade system, connecting East Africa to Arabia, Persia, India, and even China. Somali sailors mastered monsoon winds centuries before Europeans understood them, allowing predictable seasonal trade across vast distances. Cities like Zayla, Mogadishu, and Berbera grew wealthy, cosmopolitan, and influential, governed by merchant elites rather than kings. Islam strengthened these trade links, turning Somali ports into centers of learning, commerce, and diplomacy within the Muslim world. For centuries, Somalia thrived not through conquest, but through connection. This era of prosperity created a proud maritime culture, one that understood the world not as distant continents, but as reachable horizons. Somalia was not isolated, it was global, before globalization had a name. The arrival of European colonial powers in the late 19th century marked a violent interruption in Somalia's natural historical flow. Britain, Italy, and France carved Somali territories into artificial zones: British Somaliland, Italian Somaliland, French Somaliland, now Djibouti, fracturing a culturally unified people into separate colonial administrations. These borders ignored clan territories, trade routes, and social structures, planting the seeds for future instability. Somali resistance was fierce and prolonged, most famously led by Syed Mohammed Abdullah Hassan, whom the British labeled the Mad Mullah, but whom Somalis remember as a nationalist and religious leader who resisted colonial rule for over 20 years. Colonialism introduced centralized bureaucracy without legitimacy, modern weapons without stability, and economic systems designed for extraction rather than development. By the time independence arrived in 1960, Somalia inherited borders it never chose and institutions it never trusted. Independence brought hope, but also unresolved contradictions between clan and state, tradition and modernity, unity and division. The dream of a united Somali nation was born alongside the seeds of its future struggles. When Somalia finally emerged from colonial rule in 1960, the moment carried enormous emotional weight, because independence was not merely the end of foreign control, but the rebirth of a civilization that had always known itself to be one people divided by outsiders. British Somaliland and Italian Somaliland merged to form the Somali Republic, creating rare optimism in post-colonial Africa, as Somalia possessed a single language, a shared religion, and a deeply rooted sense of cultural unity. Unlike many newly independent states, Somalia appeared to have all the ingredients necessary for nationhood, and early leaders spoke passionately about democracy, pan-Somali identity, and regional unity. The dream extended beyond borders, fueled by the idea of Greater Somalia, a vision that sought to reunite Somali populations in Ethiopia's Ogaden region, Djibouti, and northern Kenya. This ambition gave Somalia a powerful sense of purpose, but it also planted the seeds of conflict, as neighboring states viewed Somali nationalism as a threat to regional stability. Still, the early years were marked by democratic elections, political debate, and cultural pride, with Mogadishu emerging as a lively capital where poetry, music, and intellectual life flourished. For a brief moment, Somalia seemed poised to become a model African nation, modern yet rooted, ambitious yet unified, but beneath the surface, the inherited colonial institutions struggled to manage clan loyalties, economic inequality, and regional tensions that independence alone could not erase. The fragile balance of Somalia's young democracy did not survive long in a world dominated by Cold War rivalry, where global powers viewed nations not as societies, but as strategic assets. In 1969, after years of political instability and corruption scandals, the Somali military seized power in a bloodless coup following the assassination of President Abdirashid Ali Shamaka. Major General Mohammed Siad Barre emerged as the new leader, promising unity, justice, and an end to clan politics. Barre aligned Somalia with the Soviet Union, adopting scientific socialism as the guiding ideology, nationalizing industries, promoting literacy campaigns, and emphasizing a strong central state. Initially, many Somalis welcomed the order and modernization efforts as roads were built, education expanded, and clan identities were officially discouraged in favor of national identity. However, beneath the slogans of unity, power became increasingly centralized, dissent was silenced, and clan favoritism quietly re-entered politics through the back door. The Cold War turned Somalia into a chessboard, with military aid flowing in not to build stability, but to secure influence. When Somalia later shifted allegiance from the Soviet Union to the United States after the Ogaden War, the same cycle repeated. Foreign weapons strengthened the regime, not the nation. Somalia's fate became entangled in global rivalries that cared little for long-term consequences. The turning point in Somalia's modern history came in the late 1972 with the Ogaden War, a conflict rooted in the dream of uniting all Somali-inhabited territories under one flag. Believing Ethiopia to be weakened by internal revolution, Siad Barre launched a military campaign to reclaim the Ogaden region, initially achieving stunning success as Somali forces advanced deep into Ethiopian territory. For a brief moment, the dream of Greater Somalia seemed within reach, but global politics intervened brutally. The Soviet Union, previously Somalia's ally, shifted support to Ethiopia, while Cuba sent thousands of troops to assist Ethiopian forces. Suddenly isolated, Somalia faced overwhelming opposition, and the war ended in catastrophic defeat. This loss shattered the myth of military invincibility and exposed the fragility of Somalia's state structure. Refugees poured into Somalia, resources were drained, and public trust in the regime began to erode. Barre responded not with reform, but with repression, targeting clans perceived as disloyal and consolidating power through fear. The Ogaden War marked the moment when Somali nationalism turned inward, fractured by betrayal, humiliation, and economic decline. What began as a unifying ambition ended as a wound that never healed, pushing Somalia onto a path of militarization, resentment, and eventual collapse. As the 1,980 seconds progressed, Somalia's centralized state weakened under the weight of corruption, economic mismanagement, and rising opposition. The socialist promise faded, replaced by authoritarian rule that relied increasingly on clan divisions to survive. Barre's government favored certain clans while punishing others, undermining the very idea of national unity it once preached. Armed opposition groups formed along clan lines, particularly in the north, where the Somali national movement rose in resistance. Cities like Hargeisa were bombarded by government forces, leaving deep scars that would later fuel Somaliland's breakaway declaration. International support dwindled as the Cold War ended, stripping the regime of strategic importance and financial lifelines. Without external backing, the state unraveled rapidly. By 1991, Siad Barre was overthrown, and with his fall, the Somali state collapsed entirely. Unlike most revolutions, there was no replacement government, no orderly transition, only a vacuum. Ministries vanished, the army disintegrated, and Somalia became one of the few modern nations to exist without a central government. What remained were clans, militias, and communities forced to govern themselves amid chaos. The collapse did not erase Somalia, it exposed the raw survival mechanisms beneath the surface, setting the stage for one of the most complex humanitarian and political crises of the modern era. Somalia's collapse shocked the international community, but the world struggled to understand what it was witnessing. Images of famine, warlords, and starving children dominated global media, reducing a complex society into symbols of failure. International interventions arrived with humanitarian intentions but limited understanding, culminating in disastrous encounters that ended with foreign withdrawal and deepened Somali mistrust of outside involvement. Somalia became synonymous with failed state, a label that ignored the fact that society continued functioning through informal networks, clan councils, Islamic courts, and local economies. While the state disappeared, Somali people adapted, trading across borders, sending remittances, and preserving culture through oral tradition and faith. Yet the absence of governance allowed violence to flourish, setting the stage for piracy, extremist movements, and prolonged instability. The fall of Somalia was not sudden. It was the result of layered failures: colonial borders, Cold War manipulation, authoritarian rule, and international neglect. And yet, even in this collapse, Somalia's story was far from over. What followed was not silence, but transformation, painful, chaotic, and misunderstood, leading to the next chapter of survival and reinvention. When Somalia's central government collapsed in 1991, the event marked something almost unprecedented in modern history. A nation did not merely change rulers or systems, it ceased to function as a state altogether. Ministries closed overnight, embassies fell silent, national institutions vanished, and the Somali army fractured into clan-based militias that answered only to local commanders. Yet Somalia did not descend into total anarchy, as often portrayed. Instead, authority fragmented and reformed at smaller, localized levels. Clan elders revived traditional conflict resolution mechanisms known as zia. Islamic scholars organized courts, and business communities protected trade routes. Ordinary Somalis adapted with remarkable speed, creating informal economies, private telecommunications networks, and remittance systems that connected the diaspora to families back home. However, the absence of centralized authority also meant there was no monopoly on violence, no national police, and no unified vision for the future. Power became fluid, shifting between warlords who controlled territory through weapons rather than legitimacy. This statelessness created a paradox. Somalia functioned socially and economically in many ways, but remained politically unrecognizable to the outside world. The collapse did not erase Somali society, it stripped away its outer shell, exposing a resilient core struggling to survive amid lawlessness, fear, and uncertainty. In the vacuum left by the fallen state, warlords emerged as the new centers of power, controlling neighborhoods, ports, airstrips, and supply routes through force rather than governance. These figures were not ideological leaders, but businessmen of violence, profiting from checkpoints, smuggling, aid diversion, and arms trading. The civil war became self-sustaining, fueled by competition for resources rather than political vision. Humanitarian aid meant to relieve suffering, often intensified conflict as militias fought over food shipments and protection contracts. Civilians were trapped between rival factions, subjected to extortion, displacement, and random violence. Entire cities like Mogadishu were carved into invisible borders, where crossing the wrong street could be fatal. Despite this chaos, Somali entrepreneurship persisted, markets reopened, traders moved goods across front lines, and families rebuilt homes, repeatedly destroyed. Violence was constant, but life continued because survival demanded it. The warlords era revealed a painful truth. When institutions collapse, power does not disappear, it reorganizes. In Somalia, it reorganized around guns, loyalty, and fear, turning the country into a patchwork of territories defined by armed control rather than shared governance. The world could not ignore Somalia's collapse, and in the early 1992, international forces arrived under the banner of humanitarian intervention. Operation Restore Hope, led by the United States, aimed to secure aid delivery and stabilize the country. Initially welcomed by civilians desperate for relief, the mission quickly became entangled in Somalia's internal power struggles. Foreign troops underestimated the complexity of Somali clan dynamics and overestimated their ability to impose order through military presence alone. Clashes with local militias escalated, culminating in the 1993 Battle of Mogadishu, where the deaths of American soldiers shocked global audiences and reshaped international attitudes toward intervention. The withdrawal that followed left Somalia deeper in chaos and more distrustful of foreign involvement. To many Somalis, the intervention symbolized the world's inability to understand their society, arriving with weapons instead of dialogue, and leaving without solutions. Somalia became a cautionary tale, reinforcing global reluctance to intervene in failed states. For Somalis, it reinforced a hard lesson. Survival would not come from outside. The international exit did not end Somalia's suffering. It merely shifted the burden entirely onto its people. As central authority remained absent, regions across Somalia began charting their own paths. In the north, Somaliland declared independence in 1991. Rebuilding stability through clan conferences, local governance, and gradual institution building. Though unrecognized internationally, Somaliland achieved relative peace and functioning governance, demonstrating that Somali-led solutions could succeed. Puntland, in the northeast, chose autonomy rather than secession, establishing its own administration while remaining nominally part of Somalia. These regions highlighted the contrast between chaos and order within the same cultural framework. Their success was not built on foreign intervention, but on negotiation, compromise, and community legitimacy. Meanwhile, southern Somalia remained fragmented, with shifting alliances and ongoing violence. This uneven development challenged the narrative of total collapse, showing that Somalia was not uniformly broken, it was unevenly rebuilding. The existence of Somaliland and Puntland forced difficult questions. Was Somalia better off decentralized? Could unity be rebuilt from below rather than imposed from above? These experiments in self-governance became both hope and controversy, revealing the complexity of restoring a nation that had learned to survive without a state. Beyond physical destruction, Somalia's civil war inflicted deep psychological wounds on its people. Generations grew up knowing nothing but conflict, displacement, and uncertainty. Trauma became normalized, passed silently from parents to children who learned survival before education. Entire communities were uprooted, creating one of the world's largest diasporas, stretching from Nairobi to Minneapolis, London to Dubai. Yet even in exile, Somali identity remained intact, preserved through language, culture, and remittances that became a lifeline for those left behind. The war reshaped social roles, forcing women into economic leadership as men were lost to fighting, migration, or death. Children matured early, navigating a world where instability was the norm. Despite this, Somalis did not lose their sense of humor, hospitality, or faith traits that acted as psychological armor. The true cost of Somalia's collapse is not only measured in deaths or destroyed buildings, but in years of stolen normalcy. And yet, the persistence of culture, family bonds, and hope reveals a society that refuses to surrender its humanity, even when the world has labeled it broken. Somali piracy did not emerge from greed or adventure, as popular media often suggests, but from a vacuum one created when the state collapsed and Somalia's long, unprotected coastline became vulnerable to exploitation. After 1991, foreign fishing fleets and illegal waste dumping operations began operating freely in Somali waters, stripping local fishermen of their livelihoods and poisoning marine ecosystems. With no coast guard, no navy, and no legal recourse, coastal communities were left defenseless. What began as self-organized patrols to protect fishing grounds gradually transformed into armed groups that demanded fees from passing vessels, a practice that escalated into full-scale piracy. As profits grew and criminal networks expanded. Young men facing unemployment and poverty found piracy to be one of the few available economic options. While piracy brought short-term wealth to certain towns, it also attracted violence, drugs, and internal conflict, destabilizing communities further. Somali piracy was not a cultural phenomenon. It was a symptom of systemic collapse, global exploitation, and economic desperation. By reducing piracy to caricature, the world ignored the deeper conditions that created it, missing an opportunity to address root causes instead of symptoms. As piracy threatened global shipping routes, the international response was swift and heavily militarized. Naval forces from NATO, the European Union, China, Russia, and others flooded the Gulf of Aden, dramatically reducing pirate attacks through patrols and armed escorts. From a security standpoint, the response was effective, but it did little to address the underlying economic and political realities on land. The narrative presented to the world framed piracy as proof of Somali lawlessness, reinforcing stereotypes of chaos and criminality. Rarely discussed were the illegal fishing fleets that triggered the crisis or the environmental damage inflicted on Somali waters. This selective storytelling turned Somalia into a villain rather than a victim, allowing global actors to secure their interests without confronting their complicity. Meanwhile, coastal communities saw piracy decline without viable alternatives, replacing it, leaving young men once again facing unemployment and instability. The international solutions solved the symptom at sea, but ignored the disease on land. Somalia's image was further damaged, its people reduced to headlines while their voices remained unheard. For ordinary Somalis living along the coast, piracy became both a curse and a stigma that overshadowed daily life. Towns like Ale and Hobyo were suddenly known worldwide, not for their culture or history, but for hostage negotiations and ransom headlines. Families faced suspicion, surveillance, and isolation, even when they had no connection to piracy. Yet, life continued, as it always had. Fishermen repaired nets, mothers raised children, and elders mediated disputes. Many communities actively opposed piracy, understanding that it brought short-term gain but long-term harm. Local religious leaders condemned it, and clan elders attempted to restrain young men from joining criminal networks. Despite these efforts, poverty and lack of opportunity made resistance difficult. The coast became a symbol of Somalia's struggle. Rich in resources, strategically vital, yet exploited and misunderstood. Piracy did not define Somali coastal culture. It distorted it, trapping communities between survival and stigma, and reinforcing the painful gap between how Somalia is lived and how it is portrayed. Global media coverage played a powerful role in shaping Somalia's image during the piracy era, often reducing a complex society to a single narrative of danger and disorder. Films, news reports, and headlines focused on hijackings and ransom dramas, rarely showing the broader context or the millions of Somalis who had nothing to do with piracy. This flattening of identity had real consequences. Tourism vanished, investment stalled, and Somali travelers faced suspicion worldwide. The piracy narrative became a shortcut for misunderstanding, erasing Somalia's ancient history, cultural depth, and ongoing efforts towards stability. This portrayal also reinforced a global hierarchy of empathy, where Somali suffering was acknowledged only when it threatened international commerce. In refugee camps, diaspora neighborhoods, and war-scarred cities, poetry nights and storytelling circles became acts of resistance against erasure. Islam, deeply embedded in daily life, provided structure, discipline, and hope, offering moral clarity amid chaos. Clan identity, often blamed for conflict, also functioned as a safety net, organizing food distribution, protection, and mutual aid when no state existed. This cultural framework allowed Somalia to endure what would have destroyed many societies. Culture became shelter, and identity became armor, proving that even when buildings fall and governments vanish, a people can remain unbroken. Daily life in Somalia is shaped by uncertainty, but not defined by despair. In cities like Mogadishu, Hargeisa, and Kismayo, markets buzz with activity, tea shops fill with conversation, and construction cranes signal cautious optimism. Families plan weddings amid security checks, children attend schools built by local initiatives, and entrepreneurs launch businesses despite risks. Rural life remains rooted in pastoral traditions, with camels, goats, and seasonal migration shaping rhythms of survival. Women play central roles as breadwinners, traders, and community organizers, often carrying households through conflict while maintaining social cohesion. Electricity may be intermittent, roads may be rough, and security may fluctuate, but Somalis adapt with creativity and resilience. Mobile money systems thrive where banks failed, allowing instant transactions across cities and borders. This everyday resilience challenges the narrative of helplessness, revealing a society that continues to function even without ideal conditions. Somalia's daily life is not a story of waiting for peace, it is a story of living, despite its absence. Islam in Somalia is not merely a religion, it is a social framework that shapes ethics, law, and community life. Mosques serve as places of worship, education, and dispute resolution. Religious leaders often fill governance gaps, mediating conflicts and promoting social cohesion. While extremist groups have attempted to hijack religious narratives, the majority of Somalis practice a moderate, community-centered Islam rooted in tradition and tolerance. Faith provides comfort in grief, discipline in hardship, and hope amid uncertainty. It also reinforces values of hospitality, charity, and collective responsibility, reminding individuals that survival is shared. During times of famine and displacement, mosques become shelters and aid hubs, reinforcing their role as pillars of society. Religion in Somalia is not static. It evolves with context while remaining deeply connected to identity. In a land where the state collapsed, faith remained constant, anchoring communities through the darkest years. Somali music and art tell stories that politics cannot. Songs of love, exile, and loss echo across generations, blending traditional rhythms with modern influences from the diaspora. Before the Civil War, Somalia had a thriving cultural scene with theaters, radio stations, and national orchestras. War scattered artists across the world, but it did not silence them. From London to Minneapolis, Somali musicians preserve and reinvent cultural expression, keeping emotional ties to the homeland alive. Visual art, fashion, and storytelling continue to evolve, reflecting themes of displacement and belonging. Even in conservative contexts, creativity finds space, serving as a quiet form of resistance. Art allows Somalis to process trauma, remember beauty, and imagine futures beyond conflict. Culture, once again, proves to be Somalia's most powerful form of continuity. Despite decades of hardship, Somali hospitality remains legendary. Guests are welcomed with tea, food, and conversation, regardless of circumstance. Humor is woven into daily life, used to diffuse tension and cope with adversity. Laughter survives alongside grief, not because suffering is ignored, but because joy is necessary for survival. Community gatherings, weddings, and celebrations persist even in insecure environments, reinforcing social bonds. These moments remind people that life is more than survival, it is connection. Somalia's greatest strength is not its land or resources, but its people, whose warmth defies the cold narratives imposed upon them. In the face of war, Somalis continue to love, laugh, and hope, proving that humanity endures even when peace feels distant. Modern Somalia exists in a space between collapse and rebirth, where progress is fragile, uneven, and often invisible to the outside world. After decades without a functioning central government, Somalia has slowly reassembled political institutions through a federal system that attempts to balance national unity with regional autonomy. Mogadishu, once synonymous with destruction, now hosts government offices, foreign embassies, and a cautious return of international engagement. Elections remain indirect and imperfect, shaped by clan-based power-sharing arrangements designed to prevent domination rather than promote democracy. While corruption and insecurity persist, the mere existence of a government, however fragile, marks a profound shift from total statelessness. Federal member states operate with varying degrees of effectiveness, reflecting Somalia's decentralized reality. This political structure is not ideal, but it represents adaptation rather than failure. Somalia is not rebuilding according to Western models, it is rebuilding according to its own social logic, negotiating peace one compromise at a time. Somalia's economy defies conventional expectations, functioning largely without formal institutions through informal trade, remittances, and entrepreneurial networks. The Somali diaspora plays a central role, sending billions of dollars annually to support families, fund businesses, and rebuild infrastructure. Mobile money platforms have revolutionized transactions, allowing cashless payments in a country where banks were once non-existent. Livestock exports, agriculture, telecommunications, and small-scale trade form the backbone of the economy, while ports and airports slowly re-enter global networks. Despite insecurity, Somali entrepreneurs display extraordinary adaptability, launching startups and rebuilding markets with minimal external support. However, poverty remains widespread, youth unemployment is high, and climate change threatens rural livelihoods through drought and flooding. Somalia's economy is resilient but vulnerable, capable of growth, yet constantly at risk from instability. The country's future depends on turning survival economics into sustainable development. Security remains Somalia's greatest challenge. Armed groups continue to exploit weak governance, targeting civilians and institutions alike. Decades of conflict have normalized violence, making peace difficult to sustain. Yet Somalis increasingly reject extremism, recognizing that endless war benefits no one. Community-based security initiatives, local militias, and international partnerships attempt to contain threats while strengthening state capacity. The cost of conflict is not only measured in lives lost, but in opportunities delayed and futures postponed. Every school closed by insecurity represents a generation pushed further behind. Despite this, Somalia's resistance to extremism grows stronger, rooted in cultural values that reject violence against innocence. The struggle for security is ongoing, but it is no longer defined solely by despair. It is defined by determination. Somalia's greatest hope lies in its youth, who make up the majority of the population and carry memories of war, but dreams of something different. Young Somalis study, create, innovate, and connect with the world. Through technology and diaspora networks, they challenge old divisions, question inherited hatreds, and imagine a Somalia defined by opportunity rather than conflict. Education, once interrupted by war, is slowly expanding through local initiatives and community-led schools. These young people are not waiting for peace, they are building it in small, practical ways. Their optimism is not naive, it is forged through experience. Somalia's future will not be shaped by those who remember power, but by those who imagine possibility. Somalia's story is not one of failure, it is one of survival against impossible odds. Empires rose and fell on its shores. Colonial borders fractured its unity. Cold War ambitions militarized its politics, and civil war erased its state. Yet Somalia endured. The country exists today not because conditions were kind, but because its people refused to vanish. Somalia reminds the world that nations are not buildings or governments, they are memory, identity, and will. When the world looked away, Somalis rebuilt quietly. When labeled hopeless, they persisted. Somalia's journey forward will be long, uneven, and uncertain, but it is moving, carried by resilience rather than illusion. To travel through Somalia is not to witness ruin, but to witness endurance, a civilization still standing after everything designed to erase it. And one day, when peace is no longer fragile but normal, Somalia will not be remembered for how it fell, but for how it survived and how it rose again on its own terms.